What I would like to really share is that while I don't always know that I communicate it in the way that I intend, there are a lot of times that what I'm providing is feedback in its own way, not in a way that is, this is something you need to correct, but maybe observations I have, whether it's around our team, whether it's around the board, whether it's around messaging. She has invited me into the strategic space in many ways. And so even when we talk about communication, I get opportunities to even help draft and create some of the, the strategic communication. So, um, but yes, sometimes be able to say those things that are not the most pleasant, but they're honest. Welcome to Beyond the Desk, Admin Advocates, Admin Takeover episode. I'm Chris Cason, Executive Administrative Partner to the IAAP CEO, Melissa Mahoney.
And I'm Rand Lunceford, Executive Assistant to the CXO, Rachel Suman. And today we're here to talk about some things that we have covered in working retreat we recently had.
Absolutely. Rand was gracious enough when we were in Kansas City together to spend an entire day talking about things that we face in our partnership, but also we think are important for our community to know about what's worked for us. And, we certainly don't have a monopoly on it. It's a work in progress, but we just wanted to kind of get into some of that and talk about, what's made it work for us in our partnerships.
Yeah, we're going to be as honest as we can and get a little bit vulnerable and hopefully give you some things you can walk away with to your partnerships as well. So, you ready to get into it, Chris?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, Chris. So, something we talked about was trust. And we talked about building trust, having vulnerability, showing up as your full self, having a bit more of a personal connection. So, can you talk about what that means to you to show up and build that trust and by being your full self and connecting with your executive in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a great conversation. I think for me, it really is around, to some degree, risk. And what I mean by that is a lot of what's worked in my partnership with Melissa has been around some aspects that are not necessarily what you would consider the traditional work deliverable. So there's what we do, the scheduling and the meetings and all of that. But a lot of where the trust comes in is the relational piece. And so it can be a different things for everybody. But for me, it's kind of like, what am I willing to share or um, leverage, even if it's something I'm kind of afraid of, that is going to get me that faster relational currency. So that's really what has worked for me, is just being willing to get, a little vulnerable and, share things that, sometimes it may even be an overshare to some degree, but it's worked and we get a lot of work done. But also there's that aspect where I know that she trusts me and I trust her with our personal experiences, that, challenges we may be facing in our personal lives. And it isn't about, it being spill the tea hour, but it really is more about, this is really what comprises my whole self. And so in bringing that to the table, it allows us to just get a little bit um, gritty, get into the weeds of things, and really have some quality interaction. So,
I totally agree. I think like even with things like scheduling, if I know what's going on in Rachel's life, it helps me to give her a better schedule and it builds the trust that way for both of us to have a bit more of a personal connection. Even things that I'm going through personally. And like you said, we don't have to divulge the most, our deepest, darkest secrets. But when you're able to talk more personally with each other, you're able to totally just get more stuff done and make it so it's more efficient for both of you. So I
agree.
love that topic.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I know that for a lot of our colleagues that may be listening to that, it can be intimidating and a little bit of, a fear, because most of us that have come up, you kind of have heard, you leave your professional things at home, and, this is how we show up at work. And there is, an aspect to that I think that applies, but, how much better all of us show up when we can be our authentic selves. And I think that is, what I think we would agree on is something that's really a necessity more than just, an option. But
Mm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people who are listening might think, you just have to get the job done and leave personal lives out of it. So, are you able to share a little bit why you think it matters? Why someone shouldn't just show up and do the job? Does it just, I can just do my work and be done with it?
yeah, I think authenticity is so important. I think people can see through a facade, or if you're kind of phoning it in to
True.
get the job done, and you know recognizing the fact that sometimes we aren't able to always step away from our workday and not be able to deliver on the things that we're responsible for. But I do think that just if you're tired or whatever the thing is that you're dealing with, it doesn't always have to be bad. It may be something you're excited about. Um, I think for me, what Melissa and I have talked about in great detail are the things that really energize us. And so there's a check-in that we're able to do that's outside of just the work itself. So it's like, how are you feeling about this? Or what are your thoughts about this? Or how does this really speak to you or doesn't speak to you? Or what things are you really passionate about? And so I think that's been really invaluable to moving the work forward in a partnership
Yeah.
dynamic. So
That's so true that you say energizes you, because I know certain meetings or work, like that really excites Rachel. She's going to have more energy, or after this meeting, she needs a break because that's the type of thing that just, she gets done and does a good job at, but doesn't necessarily energize her to keep going throughout the day. So that's a perfect way to put it.
yes, yes, I would agree. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what I would say about trust. But another aspect that we had talked about was the importance of communication. So I don't know if you want to maybe get into that a little bit, but I think that was another. We came out away with such great things that we got really, personal and into it, when we
Mm.
were together in Kansas City. But I'd be interested to hear anything you want to share about the
Yeah.
communication and what about that has really, kind of propelled your partnership.
The biggest thing I think about when I think about communication with me and Rachel is feedback. I know early on she gave me a tough piece of feedback, and feedback for me a lot is hard to not take personal, but it was so helpful to me because she was dead on. She like totally had it right, and I knew the feedback that she provided was accurate. um but it was so nice that she was able to just tell it to me straight, and she wasn't hiding the fact that there was this feedback that needed to happen. And it put me in a place where I felt comfortable to talk to her anytime that I had feedback to give to her as well. She's very open about us being able to have it be a two-way street. Um, so yeah, just us being able to be really honest with each other has really been helpful for me, and to know that again, it is a two-way street. It's not just her providing me with feedback or giving me direction, and I have a voice as well. So and that's something that a lot of executive assistants don't have, is a two-way street to provide feedback, or, you know, just to communicate with your boss. Sometimes it can be hard. So, um, I don't know. Do you have something like that too with Mel, or your
Yes.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, no, thank you for sharing that, first of all, because that can be challenging to receive hard feedback and then recognize it as being a gift,
Mhm.
of what it is. And I certainly have had those moments with Mel, but I think what I would like to really share is that while I don't always know that I communicate it in the way that I intend, there are a lot of times that what I'm providing is feedback in its own way, not in a way that is, this is something you need to correct, but maybe observations I have, whether it's around our team, whether it's around the board, whether it's around messaging. She has invited me into the strategic space in many ways. And so even when we talk about communication, I get opportunities to even help draft and create some of the strategic communication. So, but yes, sometimes being able to say those things that are not the most pleasant, but they're honest and
Mhm.
their observations. What's unique about our relationship, not only with our partners, but also with our teams and our other work groups, is that we have our ear to the ground in some respects. And so it isn't about coming back and reporting as much as it is about observations, or maybe something that is a blind spot for Mel or Rachel or whomever, that we, you know, really have a responsibility to bring to
Right.
the table. And so, like I said, sometimes it's not always articulated the way I really would think in my mind it plays out, but I will at least say it. Were you aware of this? Or I'm noticing this. And I think that it's been really well received, and I think it's helpful. And I think sometimes it's even been not even maybe what, maybe there was an idea about the way we're approaching work or something, and I might be pushing back a little bit, not in a way that's combative, but in a way that says, hey, what would really energize me, or what would really speak to me, or I think I would do my best work, is XYZ, right? So I think it's important for us to do that. And I know it can be scary because, like you said, not everyone has the level of partnerships or a willingness to partner on that level. But if you are able to move the needle even in some respects, I think it's,
Mhm.
really rewarding to be able to say, I had this idea and it was, implemented. And, I'll just throw this in here too, because we talked about that, with the partnership playbook that IAAP published and is available. Some of these things we're talking about are actually what's talked about in the book. And I
Yeah.
think that's really interesting that we didn't necessarily consult the book to get these, outcomes, but just through our natural conversation when we were together with our working retreat, we really got there around, trust, communication, and so forth.
Yeah, and I will say me and Rachel had a chance to go through and do the partnership playbook, which we will plug in the description. But that was a good way for us to open up the lines of communication too, because we were still like really new partnership. So it was an easy way to give us prompts to start having conversations and to think through things that maybe would be harder to address. And then something else I thought about that we talked about was to assume best intent, which can
Mm.
be hard, but same thing like when I'm getting feedback from Rachel, or we're having conversations, to not think, she said this because she doesn't like me or because she thinks I'm not doing a good job. It's all about, we're here to get the work done, and
Right.
we want to make sure we're addressing each other honestly, and also being kind at the same time. So just assuming best intent can be hard, and sometimes everyone doesn't have the best intent, but it can put you in the right mind space to not quickly poison yourself and how you're thinking and really make you so negative all the time. So I think that was an important topic that we brought up as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great call out. I'm glad that you mentioned that because um, you can allow a lot of those personal insecurities to kind of flood in on you. And sometimes it is, it's an opportunity to respect, the experience that our executives have around certain um, maybe programs or events or things like that. And it's not that maybe they're not open to a new way of doing things, but just it's something that we've already um,
Mm.
explored. And
Yeah.
so, and I find myself when you said that, so often will ask Mel sometimes, like, are we, like, just because sometimes I don't always know, do I have all the context around something? And
Right.
so I try to get that. And sometimes it's a swing and a miss. If you have this idea, you're like, oh, that won't work. Because,
Right.
now that you learn more, you're like, oh, okay, this is going to take a little
Definitely.
bit more resources or what have you. So
Well, it goes both ways too. Sometimes you have the insight that your executive doesn't have. Of,
that too.
no, this won't work because this is where the team's at, or
Right.
anything like that. So that's a really good point.
Yes.
And something I wanted to say too that we spoke about is that sometimes you might not realize that you might be the holdup in the communication. So it's important to
Mm,
be really honest with yourself and think, are you have you been the problem, or really just being honest and analyzing where has there been a communication breakdown, or you might have to be brave and address it with your executive and tell them, I think we've been having a problem with communication. Just being really honest with them can be really helpful.
that's a good point. And something else that makes me think about even the manner in which you're communicating may not always be that you have an opportunity to hop on a phone call. Like sometimes, with Mel and I, sometimes it's a text message, sometimes it's a instant message, a Teams message, because sometimes it's a situation where they get ready to go into a meeting, or you don't have the opportunity to always have FaceTime with your executive. And both of us, we should mention both of us reside in totally different
Yeah.
states than our executive, and so we are not, right outside their doors, and we know that that's the same for a lot of our colleagues, in our community listening to and watching, this podcast. But I think that's important to know that you may have to be open to different types of messaging and take
Mhm.
that as good enough, because you may not, you want to be ahead of something, but also it may not fit quite so neatly into your typical communication style.
Definitely. Yeah. Anytime I tell people I live in a different state from my executive, they are like in shock.
Yes.
But it
Same.
works if you like I know how she prefers to communicate. She knows how I prefer to communicate, what hours we can communicate with each other, and we're really good about setting our one-on-ones together and making sure that if we have to miss them, we reschedule it or find a better time for it. I feel like that kind of leads us into a good area of the leveling up. Like, where do we go
Mm.
from here? What's next? Like, what are our takeaways? Do you have any thoughts on that right away?
Well, yeah, I think that with some of the things we talked about, and not only today, but also with our working retreat, like there's an opportunity for growth and kind of an uncharted path. And so I think that that is what I find most thrilling about it. So, for example, I'll just use, in my case, there was an opportunity to go to explore a title change for what my previous title was. And it was more around reflecting our partnership in a way that is really evidence of how we work, but also um, an opportunity to hopefully connect with our community and neighborhood. So, um, our profession. So, what I mean by that is, there was thoughts around like, well, do you go for chief of staff, or do you go for something else that had a real cool sound? And in some spaces it works, in some businesses, but I can tell you, Mel and I really got into some real deep work around what would be the best fit for us and our partnership and our team and our community. And so that was really born out of kind of a long-standing trust and communication. She really understood that for me, it wasn't about getting the fanciest title, but it really was about something that resonated with with our peers. And so I was really proud of the work that I got to do around that, the outcome. And while it wasn't that I really changed in the work I was doing, it just was about making sure it was donning something that was really us, and it was us as a unit. It wasn't just about, oh, I got this, promotion or this title. So that's just an example I can think of
Yeah.
offhand. But I think a lot of really cool things come out of when you can kind of get past some of the baseline and move into that, what is next, what's exciting. It's different for everybody. That was something I was able to accomplish, but there's new things on the horizon. So,
Yeah.
what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
Something that stands out to me is we talked about a lot, like what are our fears? And we
Yes.
got really honest about that. And we talked about, what if there's a change in the company? What if I decide to leave? What if my executive decides to leave? There's lots of different things that can happen in a partnership, and lots of things can come up, and you can't always plan for all those things.
Yes.
So, something that has been helpful for me when I'm thinking about those things is just being really honest with Rachel, and has been really honest with me, which has been helpful. But just knowing that I can't plan for everything that will happen necessarily, but um, it is nice on my end to know that I'm in good hands. And again, I know that everyone doesn't have that, so I think just being able to plan as much as you can, but I think that being truthful, being honest with your executive can really help you if you're not in a space necessarily where you always have that back and forth support. And something too that I think is proof with both of us being here is to rely on other admins. And even if you don't have other admins, I know that's a big part of why I originally joined IAAP, because I was the only admin at my company. So being able to find community, other mentors, other people to work with, that can be a good way to level up. If you're stuck in a space where maybe you don't have the executive support, go find other community. There's plenty of people out there that want to support and help admins grow. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Like IAAP.
yes, yeah.
But no, that's good. And something that you touched on that made me think going back to something we talked about earlier is whether it's trust, communication, or just growth as a partner. Like it doesn't always mean agreement, and I think that's really important to mention. Alignment, yes, to a certain point, especially if it's around strategic, um, goals or KPIs. But I think I'll take Mel and I are very different in our personal belief system and our values. Not very different. I'll say there are some that are, but there are differences, and we
Yeah.
don't always. When I say agree, we have different beliefs and we approach situations differently. But there is a level of respect that permeates our partnership and our relationship. So it doesn't require us to always agree on every single thing. And there's a curiosity that I know definitely on her part around my beliefs in certain things. And that started way back when we really were first partnering on, one-on-one more so, a few years ago. And so I just think that's really important to mention that it doesn't always mean that you have to be like a clone or just like that person. Where obviously, even you and I being, gentlemen in the profession, supporting, female executives, I think that's a different dynamic in of itself, but it works. We have a long distance partnership, but it works. And so I just think that's another thing too, when you talk about leveling up is really exploring and being curious around what could you do? Do you have to stay in this, one area, or could you dream big and go further? So,
Well, that really loops back to the beginning too. You don't have to be their best friend, but if you can find areas where you can connect personally, then you'll be set up to have a good partnership. But you don't need to go out to dinner all the time or hang out necessarily. If you can make a small personal connection, find what you agree on a few things.
yes,
And yeah, you don't have to be the twin of your executive. You can be
Yes.
your own person as well. That's super important to not lose your identity too.
absolutely. And even when it comes to, you had mentioned earlier, when you really understand your partner, it's being able to compliment them in those ways. And so it's, in our partnership with Mel and I, we're really technically both introverts, but, and so we both know when we've had a lot of interaction that drains us. And so we try to account for that. And so there have been times where it's like, that may not mean that we're going to dinner. It may mean that we're each going to be in our own hotel
Right.
rooms or however that, depending on the event or what the occasion is. But we really understand that, and it's a good thing. And we're kind of like, yeah, that's perfect. So, yeah, I just throw that in too.
Yeah, I mean, and you guys are a good pair too because you can lean on each other if you need in those moments. You know when Mel needs a break, she knows when you need a break.
Right.
I love that.
Yes. Well, and I think you and Rachel have that too, even if it's a different dynamic.
Mhm.
So yeah. So
I love that. That was a great conversation.
yeah, no, I thank you so much for doing this podcast and also the working retreat. And, we hope that this has been helpful in any shape or form. And, maybe we'll do it again. We uncovered a lot of things, like you said, when we were together, and some things, were too private to share here, but we definitely have more that we, love to share with the community, or would love to hear from you all on things that, you're interested about.
Yeah. And I would encourage any admin watching, find that admin who you can connect with and have these conversations and talk about the things that maybe you wouldn't talk about on camera, but it's helpful for you to work through issues you're having or to help yourself grow professionally. So,
Absolutely. Well, thanks for watching this episode of Admin
admin,
Takeover.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.